First at 6, the latest in a KARE 11 investigation. Congress now taking action to make organ transplants easier for veterans. Thanks for joining us. A veteran who was nearly dying thanks to a series of blunders by the VA and its inability to handle his lung transplant reached out to KARE 11 from halfway across the country.
Investigative reporter A.J. Legault continues his national investigation, Distance, Delays, and Denial, and shows us how Congress is now taking action to make organ transplants easier for veterans.
Can't breathe, just no matter how hard. Your stomach muscles hurt sometimes so bad that you feel like you've been doing sit-ups.
If Jim Thayer doesn't get a lung transplant soon, he may die.
It seems like about every 5 months I lose another 20 to 25% of the function of my lungs.
He's been waiting and waiting for a transplant.
For some reason, the VA keeps on denying that.
In these letters to members of Congress, the VA admits to numerous mistakes.
My records have been mixed up with somebody else's.
To make things even worse, the VA asked him to leave his home in Colorado and travel 1,500 miles away to Seattle for testing, one of the only 2 places in the country where vets can get lung transplants.
I just don't think this traveling back and forth is working. They need to do it at a local hospital.
In KARE 11's original investigation from 2016, we detailed research done by Dr. David Goldberg at the University of Pennsylvania. His study focused on liver transplants and found the further away a veteran lived from a transplant center, the higher the likelihood of death.
Veterans that were more than 100 miles away from the closest transplant center are disadvantaged. They have less access to a life-saving transplant, which directly then correlates to a higher chance of dying.
Since that report aired, Congress has responded.
When we found out that veterans actually had to travel so far to get their transplants, it didn't make sense right on the face of it.
Representative Neil Dunn of Florida, a doctor who served 11 years as an Army surgeon, introduced the Veterans Increased Choice for Transplanted Organs and Recovery, or VICTOR Act of 2017. It would allow veterans who live more than 100 miles from one of the nation's VA transplant centers to seek care at a non-VA facility that covers Medicare patients.
It's better care for the veterans. Simply, they're much more likely to get a transplant. They're much more likely to have a successful transplant. And of course, that improves their survival as well.
If passed, for Thayer, the new law could mean no more trips to Seattle, where he's already gone twice, both times coming back home out of breath and without new lungs.
I don't feel like going to Seattle anymore. I don't trust them.
Well, since our Distance, Delays, and Denials investigation first aired in August of 2016, we've continued to hear from veterans like Jim from across the country with transplant horror stories. Congress is holding a hearing tomorrow on the VICTOR Act, which has bipartisan support. And Congressman Dunn tells me he thinks this bill could pass possibly through Congress by the end of the year, meaning veterans could start getting these transplants much closer to home.
Well, hopefully soon enough for this guy.
Yeah, we do know the VA is started working with him since we partnered with our sister station out in Denver to tell his story.
Yeah.
And, they've started to take some action to help him
hope
already. So.
All right.
This is, again, one of those things that's just smart, all in the interest of the best care for our veterans.
A key vote in Congress today aimed at fixing problems exposed by a KARE 11 investigation. That report showed how sick veterans in need of organ transplants were being forced to travel long distances to get their operations.
Tonight, a major development from the nation's capital. Investigative reporter A.J. Legault joining us now with the very latest developments.
Rena, Randy, in a bipartisan vote, the U.S. House of Representatives just passed legislation late this afternoon that will allow veterans to get life-saving organ transplants closer to home. You know, it hopefully is going to fix the bureaucratic quagmire we documented in our series, Distance, Delays, and Denial.
How many patients do you think unnecessarily died because of this system?
Thousands.
It's been a year since KARE 11 first broadcast this interview. A VA organ transplant manager turned whistleblower exposing problems in the VA's organ transplant program.
The problem has not been solved, period.
Instead of being allowed to get a transplant at private hospitals close to home, the VA routinely requires veterans to travel thousands of miles to one of its own transplant centers. There are 14 of them, but each one only does certain types of transplants.
It adds an insult to the injury, if you will.
This Texas Army veteran was told he had to get his lung transplant in Wisconsin.
if something doesn't go as well as we would hope, that may be where I would, where my story would end, is a long way from home.
Uprooting patients and their families isn't just inconvenient. A study published in 2014 by the University of Pennsylvania found the extended distance between veterans and their transplant facility increases the risk of death.
Was in the Army.
This Minnesota widow believes her husband's case is a prime example.
And he didn't get it.
Pam Moore's husband, John, had to repeatedly travel to a VA hospital in Texas and died waiting for a liver transplant.
My husband should have been home, not in Texas.
Congress promised to look into what we exposed. Representative Neil Dunn, a former Army surgeon, says what we'd found made no sense.
I applaud you. I read your article on the subject. Outstanding. Yeah, I didn't really realize, until you've talked to people who've been through this, it's hard to imagine that a bureaucracy actually comes up with answers like that.
Today, the U.S. House voted to approve the bill Dunn introduced, the Veterans Increased Choice for Transplanted Organs and Recovery, or VICTOR Act of 2017. It would allow veterans who live more than 100 miles from one of the nation's VA transplant centers to seek care at a non-VA facility.
Once you lay out the facts for everybody, it's pretty obvious that this is the right way to proceed.
Well, that bill now heads to the Senate, and with today's bipartisan support in the House, Congressman Dunn says he hopes it will be on President Trump's desk by the end of the year.
Good work, AJ.
Great job, AJ.
Yeah, definitely a big step today towards something that affects a lot of veterans.
Great news.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Some troubling new medical findings mirror an issue Care 11 has been investigating for more than a year. New research finds VA patients who need a kidney transplant experience lower transplant rates and higher death rates while on the wait list than patients with private insurance. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault with his continuing series, Distance, Delays, and Denial.
Was in the Army.
In the summer of 2016, Care 11 shared the story of Pam Moore.
And he didn't get it.
The Minnesota widow's husband, John, had to repeatedly travel to a VA hospital in Texas and died waiting for a liver transplant.
My husband should have been home, not in Texas.
Instead of being allowed to get a transplant at private hospitals close to home, the VA routinely requires veterans to travel to one of its own transplant centers. There are only 14 of them, and each one only does certain types of transplants.
The problem has not been solved, period.
This VA organ transplant manager turned whistleblower told us the distance often leads to deadly delays.
How many patients do you think unnecessarily died because of this system?
Thousands.
In Ohio, at the Cleveland Clinic, research was recently published that lends credence to that allegation. It found veterans who rely on the VA are 28% less likely to actually get a transplant than those with private insurance. Dr. Joseph Augustine is the lead author.
And what we found on a national level was that VA patients had less transplant over time compared to patients with either private insurance or Medicare insurance.
A big and potentially deadly factor, the distance veterans like Aaron Arch are forced to travel. The researchers found VA patients travel a lot longer distance to get a life-saving kidney, 282 miles on average for vets, compared to just 23 miles for non-VA patients. That's 12 times further.
So the distance itself appeared to be potentially a big barrier for transplantation.
In the wake of our investigation last year, Congress promised action. A federal bill passed with broad bipartisan support in the House to allow veterans who live more than 100 miles from a VA transplant center to seek care at a non-VA facility. So far, the Senate has failed to pick that bill up. But just yesterday, the issue was again being discussed by lawmakers at the Capitol who seem to realize the current system is just not working right.